Welcome back to Sex and Space, the podcast where we talk about sex across all of its infinite dimensions. Today we're joined by Shaun Hill from the New Zealand Drug Foundation to talk about the program that he leads called ReWired, which, if you're unfamiliar, responds to queer methamphetamine use in the party and play scene. Today we talk about all things chemsex and party and play, including how we think about drug use in relation to consent, as well as sex, communication and pleasure. Let's jump in. Welcome back to another episode of the Sex and Space podcast. Shaun, thank you so much for being with us today.
Very happy to be here.
Amazing, thank you. So I thought I would kick off by asking you how you like to introduce yourself and the work that you do.
Yep. So kia ora everyone listening, I'm Shaun. I am currently working with the New Zealand Drug Foundation as what's known as the ReWired Program Lead. I'll get into that in a little bit, but essentially I'm a queer Pākehā guy who's been living in Auckland for around the last 3 or 4 years or so now, originally from a little town called Ngātia down towards the Coromandel Peninsula, and I've just kind of come into this space with a really fun focus on drug use, sex, and pleasure. It's a lot of just, I always try and remind myself of that's kind of who I am at the core, as someone who has a fair amount of experience with these things, likes to share that with other folks, and likes to make sure that people are getting exactly what they want out of the experiences they're kind of navigating.
Which is very cool. And could you tell us a bit about how you came to be involved in such an interesting space like this one?
Yeah, absolutely. So originally, I studied a background in psychology and criminology, mostly the latter in this case. And ironically, growing up, I was extremely anti-drug. It's been a fun little transformation in this environment of I used to look around at my peers who were drinking and experimenting with weed and stuff like that, and always thought they're going to fuck up their futures, had quite negative experiences with it growing up, both around family environments and also seeing what some mates had gone through and the trials and tribulations they were experiencing, and went into the psych and crim space of I'm going to help find a way to ensure that folks don't have to be doing this, really on that almost abolitionist type mindset of the drugs and alcohol are evil, that kind of thing. And then I remember distinctly in my second year of uni, with my prof who would later go on to supervise my research, Fiona Hutton, there was a course Drugs, Risk and Play that turned my entire world upside down, quite literally. I had kind of been a little bit ebbing away from that mindset early on in uni of I'll experiment with this a little bit, but always behind closed doors and always still with that outward, almost ironic betrayal of I'll be saying one thing to peers and then doing one thing myself, especially around combining sex and drugs in that space, of really getting my experimentation early on in that. And that course helped kind of highlight and open harm reduction as a pathway to me, and really kind of helped instill a different set of values around actually all of this focus on trying to stop people from using and protect them from themselves, and that kind of mentality was just doing more harm than good in nearly every single study that was kind of delving into it, and people's kind of personal use experiences and such, and started moving me towards a mentality of play is important and experiencing things is key to actually learning about them, and preventing people from having those experiences is not going to be a good practice in the long run. Trying to shut topics away and stop us from talking about it is just going to inherently cause a lot of damage to folks. And I reflected back on a lot of my kind of experimentation as a queer guy early on, and started putting two and two together of not being able to talk about those experiences or be open and upfront about them and share that with others and discuss it in an open forum is what led me to experiencing some of the harms that I did in that space. So why would I start inflicting that on other people or trying to lead towards the same path? From that point on, just kind of started centering some of those values and started getting towards my last year of uni, my honours year, research with the communities that I was starting to become a bit of a part of, and just allowing myself to actually look at what would it look like if we kind of stepped away from a bit of the like overt control, the over medicalization, especially in queer spaces, and actually just started asking people about how they navigated this, what they enjoyed about it, how they thought about and conceptualized harm, how they reduced it, and yeah, led to some research with like the chemsex and party and play communities down there, where yeah, I just got a whole ton of insights and also a whole ton of personal strategies and tools that I could start implementing in like my wider experimentation around these things as well, from listening to folks who had been involved from it and their kind of pitfalls, and like that open fostering of conversation is what started leading me towards wanting to do it in a professional space as well as an academic one.
And just going back to those terms that you used, chemsex and party and play, for any of our listeners who might not be familiar with what those are, could you unpack those a bit for us?
Absolutely. So chemsex and party and play, easiest way to think about it for your kind of layperson is sex and drugs combined. So in this case, it's particularly a kind of queer form of using, often specific to, and like started off with more gay and bisexual men and other men who are obsessed with men, but is now starting to expand a bit more towards like queer and trans folks as well. Anyone in that kind of non-binary space who shares some of the sexual networks there. Towards, usually in New Zealand, it's methamphetamine and GHB use with a bit of guest starring with things like cocaine, ketamine, like poppers or amyl nitrate, and other things that help support people to have the sex that they want, like erectile dysfunction drugs and stuff like that, like Viagra, Cialis, etc. So a really intentional blending and combining and using drugs specifically for that sexual purpose. Yeah, that's kind of how I frame up chemsex, party and play. Quite a queer experience, but also very much acknowledging like these things happen all across the spectrum of sexuality and gender here. It's just that gays in particular are well known for being studied because of the whole like risky aspect of it, and particularly around HIV transmission and things like that. People really like to zero in and take a magnifying glass to it, and so we've just got a lot of research attention, whereas no other communities have really had that same level of scrutiny kind of put upon them specifically in this area. We know it's kind of happening out there anecdotally and people talk about it and share their experiences, but there's a lot less of an opportunity to do so.
And can you talk us through what the ReWired project is all about and your role within that specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So ReWired is the Drug Foundation partnership with Burnett Foundation, Body Positive, and Odyssey House, designed to respond to basically queer methamphetamine use in that party and play scene. So ReWired began as a piloted project from around late 2019 or so, brought over from Australia by my previous co-facilitator, Seb Stewart. Essentially, ReWired is designed around like helping queer men, gay, bisexual, other men who are obsessed with men who have a relationship with party and play, change that in some kind of way. So it began as like an 8-week kind of program, exploring a variety of different topics. Think of like a mutual aid group, like your AA, NA kind of smart recovery, but without any kind of explicit, overt, like either religious aspect to it, and without an expectation of abstinence as well. So very much taking a harm reduction focus to things, where we encourage folks through conversation and reflection with their peers to look at what that relationship is going to look like for them, what ideally it's going to be in future, and exploring steps towards achieving that. So we'll explore a variety of different kind of tools and strategies for doing it, sharing it amongst our kind of peer-based sphere, and exploring topics that like are quite salient for folks going through that. Things like intimacy and connection, like strategies and tools, like how we explore our sexual health and talk about it and negotiate consent, as well as just kind of personal values and things like that, and actually kind of getting back to what and who we are at our core.
And have those what kind of gets brought up, has that changed over the past few years, like since it's been like brought to New Zealand?
I would say the topics at hand are often pretty consistent. There's often been developments in how people have framed them or talked about them. Often early on, it was quite an abstinence-focused space because the people attending, that was what they were desiring. But over time, we've seen a bit more of a trend towards folks kind of curious about exploring that relationship more, stepping into it and bringing a bit more of that harm reduction vibe and ethos into it, as well as more and more growth around the role that technology plays in this space as well. So kind of developments around and a really big emphasis on the kind of connection and community aspects, especially in response to COVID coming up, where when all that you're able to kind of use is technology and kind of queer bar spaces and such were no longer really available, people gravitating towards the internet and exploring ways to kind of safely use in that space or obey lockdown rules and things like that, where they weren't really people navigating how to achieve the sex that they want in this space while still wanting to kind of keep themselves safe and protect themselves was something that came up quite a lot in the last couple of years or so. And risks around navigating that and how it interplays with sexual health and how to have those conversations with other partners kind of came a lot more to the fore.
And with your work in this project, what have you found to be most rewarding about your involvement in it?
More than anything, and it harks back to my research back in the day as well, is the most rewarding thing is just hearing everyone's individual journeys in this space. We have such fascinating relationships with sex and drugs, each and every one of us, and we all make decisions and choices around what to use, if we use it all, how we go about getting the sex that we'd like, whether or not we want to blend those two things, and our complex relationships with how that kind of bounces off who we are as people, what we're desiring and valuing in this space. And more than anything, everyone seems to have some form of relevant glimmer of knowledge to be able to share, or just the that kind of honored process by people opening themselves up to topics that we never get a chance to discuss otherwise. When is the last time that you've really sat down with kind of a mate outside of when there's been a perceived problem around things to talk about how we use different drugs or how we go about getting the sex that we'd like? People kind of shy away from this. There's so much stigma around it that we feel discouraged from actually diving into these things. And ReWired creates, I always hesitate using the word kind of sacred, but it really does feel like a very special environment where conversations that would never happen otherwise get brought to the foray and actually dissected and interrogated, and we get to explore what it means for each of us and come away with a deeper understanding.
For anyone listening at home who's maybe thinking to themselves, how can I go about starting to have those conversations with others about, how to go about getting the sex that I want, or, drug use, what advice would you give to them?
Honestly, first and foremost, starting with a bit of personal reflection. There's a writer that I really, really love, Alexander Cheeves, who shared a bit of advice that he'd received ages ago by a fuck buddy of his around constant, in a new relationship, for example, every couple of months or so, go back and reflect on the 4 F's of friends, family, fucks, and finances, and have an earnest, honest sit-down chat about how those things are going for you, whether you want more or less of them, how your relationship with them is all kind of looking. Basically just a great little reflection tool of sorts to say cool, am I seeing my family as often as I'd like to? like, what are the relationships there like? How about friends? What does this look like? When it comes to fucks, that can look at like anything from active sexual connections, especially depending on whether or not you're having these with other folks outside of maybe that relationship, talking about open and polyamorous situations, or if there's desire around those things, if you aren't currently in that space. And the finances, of course, looking at how things are going earnestly right then in that moment and what are my goals in future. And yes, that advice was given in the context of like an active relationship, but I still think it's just as valuable to apply that in any kind of conversation with ourselves, around like, what are my genuine desires here? Identifying those as the first step to be able to start embracing conversations around them, and just opening up an earnest space around it. So with regular sexual partners, for example, making time towards talking about what you both want out of that kind of experience. Talking about kind of desires and wants and things that maybe don't really do it for us as well, so you can kind of negotiate that experience as you go, is what comes to mind first and foremost around like advice that I'd give to anyone wanting to start this conversation. I can't really tell you about how to do that because that's going to be unique to you, and unique to your own relationship with these things. And again, acknowledging that there's that big overlay of stigma around it. Like, we are discouraged from having these conversations or talking about pleasure at its core, first and foremost. That really big struggle of like, sex should just be for procreation, or like sex should be between like married partners and all that kind of stuff, which I inherently roll my eyes at all the time. Like, I recognize it's somewhat of like a larger issue, but as someone who that has never been on the cards really for me. It just was something that got instilled early on by mentors in my space, around like how to approach that. And actually, like, if we're keeping pleasure at the center of what we do, then exploring things like danger and risk and such get like an extra skew or an extra lens over it that doesn't feel like a punishment of sorts. Like, sex should be about fun. Honestly, it should be a great thing for everyone involved. It should be like happy and enthusiastic and fulfilling. And if it isn't those things, coming back around to what does it take to make that happen, is key for me.
I really like that, the 4Fs. I think that's a really great framework to take away, and think about on a regular basis and do that kind of check-in with yourself. I really like that. And in terms of your work that you do with ReWired, is there something in particular that you've found has challenged you?
Yeah, again, it really does come back to the kind of individual conversations that I had, and like the heaviness and the burden that often sits with unpacking those things. Like, yep, there's absolutely a lot of joy and elation when we get to bring those topics to the forefront. But at the same time, hearing about some folks' kind of experiences about why they've kind of got into the space in the first place, can be really, really tricky to navigate. And especially when it's coming towards like wider conversations, with, say, our alcohol and other drug sector, or our sexual health sector, or police and corrections and things like that. These are all kind of spaces we work at for the workforce development side of ReWired. Just that kind of that graded experience where, like, ideally we'd love to jump into a conversation at this kind of level around chemsex and party and play and like the specifics around queer drug use, because that's what it's kind of designed around. But having to jump all the way back to the kind of base of that pyramid and be like, so do you, like, for an alcohol and other drug service, for example, do you ask about sex at all? Do you ask around sexuality and gender, first off, in any of the services that you're doing? Because if you're not asking about those things either, then getting towards the second step here is just going to be near impossible. So really, like, getting back to the kind of building blocks, and like what I always find challenging is having to pace myself in those conversations of sorts, or remind, like, yeah, everyone is on a very significant journey with this because of all of our social barriers around it. It's tricky to navigate. So slowing back down and being like, cool, start at the base, start at the building blocks. Let's talk about sex, or for the sexual health services, let's talk about drugs and their effects in this space, and how to actually go about like getting those kind of conversations open and upfront for services that otherwise would not be exploring them at all.
Yeah. I want to move to the topic of consent now because that's a very complex subject. How can you talk to us about how people can navigate the topic of consent while also considering drug use at the same time?
Absolutely. For me, consent and drug use is always at the starting point of it is always getting back to kind of a harm reduction basics of understanding what we're expecting out of an experience. Your classic kind of drug set and setting. So building on an understanding of what do I know about what I'm about to be taking? What do I know about the doses that I should be taking for this, or the route of administration that I'm using in this space? Like, what am I expecting out of the experience based on the drug here? Moving on to your kind of set, reflecting on how you are in this moment, how the kind of like how your mental framework is right now in this space, and your setting, of course, especially if it's in a sexual space, of like how is the environment set up around me? Like, am I in a comfortable room, comfortable setting? Is this in like a bathhouse or a dark room, or is this happening at home with like a regular partner or anything like this? All of these other things. If we're going back to that basic understanding of like, what do I expect to happen to me if I'm taking this, it helps really inform what other steps towards negotiating consent we can be taking. Using GHB as an example, one that's relatively commonly used across like a wider range of sexuality and gender presentations. We see like GHB is well known for being a drug that a small amount can tip you over towards overdose compared to like an active or ideal kind of dose there. And so if you have that kind of knowledge up front and you've done a little bit of reflection around like what kind of a good dose might look like for you, or starting low, going slow, etc., it helps inform that consent conversation, because you get to talk with your sexual partners around, hey, if I start to look a little bit out of it, like, what are we going to do if this happens for either of us? Like, how do we stop? How do we care for one another in this space? And that's really easily said and done when it's just two people involved. When it starts ballooning out towards like 3 or 4 or 5, or kind of an orgy type situation, like that idea of care gets expanded out into more of kind of a community layer of sorts. So kind of starts feeding into our cultural mores around like what happens in these environments. I guess going back to the more like basic things around like drug use and consent, it would look like things like actively talking up front and negotiating around like how much you plan to be using in this space, like what your kind of experience level is, what you're expecting out of it, etc. And bringing those in with similarly what you're desiring out of the experience. Is it something that you're wanting to do because you're explicitly looking to say, like, push your boundaries a bit? Would that mean that you should be requiring a bit of a safe word, or like a traffic light system in this, of like, you know, red is an absolute stop, orange is a something's kind of happening here and I would like it to kind of slow down, or green is like a fuck yeah, just keep going, like I'm on like a great stage at this point. And weaving those things in together, again, easier said than done, but I think there's a really big overt worry or concern that it has to be this big, almost like litigious type process, when it can happen really, really naturally if you're going into this with openness and curiosity and centering pleasure and desire around it. It starts opening up and naturally leading towards those questions of what would feel good in this space? What would you like out of this? How do we both work together to achieve this? That kind of thing.
And kind of like leading on from that, in spaces where consent is often given non-verbally, how can people sort of think about negotiating that kind of situation?
Yeah, this came up from like reflecting on spaces like dark rooms and back rooms and bathhouses and things like that, which are relatively common in kind of gay and bisexual kind of spheres, where talking is not really the norm at all. Environments where it would kind of kill or harsh the vibe in a sense. And so there's still obviously a need for negotiating consent in these environments. There's still a need to make sure that everyone is involved and having a good time and okay with what's going on. And it looks like things like, I think about my own examples of going to plenty of like large scale dance events where the music is so loud that you can barely hear the person next to you or your own heartbeat, let alone actually like talk about what you'd like out of the experience. It would look like things like kind of safer kind of touch areas, like a gentle scratch of the chest or something like that, or like looking at and getting eye contact first and communicating non-verbally through either gestures or eye contact or active movements. I think, for example, about times when someone has been approaching me that I might not be interested in. I might have started with that. It's not reciprocating that action. It's looking directly away from someone. It's if things continue and they're not kind of taking a hint in that space, it's actively moving out of it. If things do come down to it, absolutely. Use your voice and speak up and give a very clear and direct no, or like, like crossed over hand sign or anything like that, or the kind of semi-universal, like cutthroat kind of gesture there of like, no, this is not okay, not interested, etc. It can also look like things like in backroom spaces. Someone might be kind of blindfolded, bent over a piece of furniture, and kind of inviting people in that sense. There's forms of implicit consent. In those situations, it can look like similar, kind of like exploratory touch at first, or if it really is kind of unclear, or you're wanting to really make sure, or you might be nervous about, or very new to these spaces, like actively just bending down and gently like whispering in someone's ear and asking and things like that. Like, yeah, the kind of like overt, like out loud talking negotiation doesn't happen as much in these spaces, but those very quiet, like, quick, easy check-ins are really important. And similarly, those check-ins are very, very key throughout this whole experience as well. If we're circling back a little bit to the kind of drug use and consent situations, when those things can sometimes be overlapping in these spaces too, it can be getting like that almost enthusiastic discussion, or like, mostly comes back to like monosyllabic kind of grunts and stuff like that, or just like or like nods and like intense eye contact and things like that, and repeatedly checking in through that process, especially when there's substances involved with it, to make sure that people are still alert and engaged and actively like present in that moment. And if they're not, slowing things down, stopping, ensuring that you're actually checking in before continuing or changing things up, or taking a little bit of a break or a breather, that kind of thing.
I think it's that continuous checking in, which is, so important, because it's, again, consent is one of those things that's not fixed. It can start in one point and it can shift over time and through the experience. So that's quite an important thing to keep in mind. And I wonder, through all the work that you've done, is there's one particular thing that maybe you wish more people knew about consent?
The one thing that I wish people kind of knew about consent in this space is always, for me, around treating consent as less of an enthusiastic, like, yes exercise, or like a barrier to getting what you want out of this, and treating it much more like a dance of sorts, or as kind of a series of doorways to be opened that allows for kind of greater levels and greater tiers of pleasure. So I always talk about the whole, like, the negotiation process kind of mentioned earlier, of like upfront talking about desires and wants. And I think queer spaces do it really, really well comparatively to a lot more heterosexual environments. If I think back to like the Me Too movement and things like that, where that was kind of much more oriented around, what's the best way to put it? Like heterosexuality, men's experiences of being kind of the gatekeepers of pleasure in a sense, and like not having a lot of respect for women's sexual autonomy in that space, or like women actively getting pleasure. If we extract that more into a queer space where there is a bit more of like a level playing field, or things get shifted or changed a bit, it becomes much more of a discussion around what is mutually needed in this. If we think about kink and BDSM communities, for example, a phrase that gets thrown around really often that I love is RAC, or risk-aware consensual kink. It's about recognizing and upfront talking about like, cool, what are like the health or safety risks of this? What are the kind of risks to ourselves and others in this space, and making sure we're both aware of what's going on here, and everything within that kind of boundary is then all right to kind of play around with. Yes, you're still kind of actively negotiating consent. That's why things like safe words and traffic light systems are so integral in those spaces. But once people have had that more kind of negotiation or discussion around what it is that they're doing and what it is that they're going to be engaging in, everything else is kind of on the table, and you can start working towards kind of higher tiers, so to speak, of pleasure and desire, where people can feel really fulfilled or have that base level of trust and security with a partner, where they might originally they might have originally said no to something that would have been happening, but with that kind of faith and trust and establishing that baseline level allows them to kind of engage with an experience and find something that they really find a lot of pleasure or engagement in, that kind of thing.
It's a really big communication piece at the end of the day, isn't it? It's like, that's just the most important thing. And I think what's tough about that is that we often don't get taught communication skills.
No, absolutely not.
I just want to quickly go back to your work at ReWired, because I want to make sure that people who are listening, if they want to find out more about it, they know where they can find more information and where they can access that. So could you maybe talk our listeners through that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So the best places to kind of reach it are, like, if you're wanting to send kind of a direct email or kind of get in touch that way and hear a bit more about what's happening in that space, hello@rewired.org.nz is the best way to reach us. We've also got a new website at rewired.org.nz, but otherwise can find other information through our Drug Foundation site. We've got around 8 intakes a year currently. We usually post updates through our Burnett socials as well. That's pretty much the best way to get in contact with us around that at the moment.
Cool. And is there, in terms of the topics of sex and drugs and consent and pleasure, is there anything I haven't asked that you'd really like to share with our listeners today?
Nothing else kind of comes to mind at this time. Like, I feel like it's been a pretty deep and robust conversation already about things that are highly complex, and I'd love to spend more time exploring them, but
I mean, I think we're going to have to invite you back and do like a second one, maybe like explore some of those threads a bit more, because there is always so much to be discussed and so many conversations to be had, and I think we could have easily sort of latched onto one of these many different kind of topics and gone a lot further down.
Absolutely.
Because it's one of those things that there's so much to learn, and I think that having conversations is such a great way for people to get more information and to kind of reframe their thinking around it. Yeah. So
fully agree.
Thank you so much, Shaun, for your time and for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have you. And to all those listening, again, if you want to find out more information, check out the website. Keep up to date with all those workshops that are happening. Thank you so much, Shaun.
Easy. Thanks so much for the time. It's been lovely being here.
We really hope you enjoyed today's episode. Before we sign off, we wanted to remind you to check out our 2 books that we have available: How to Talk with Your Kids About Porn and The Organ Education Forgot. These are both available as downloadable PDFs or in print, and you can head over to sexandspace.com to grab your copy. If you do, not only will you be educating yourself about a very important subject, but you'll also be supporting us in all the work that we do. If you'd like to support us in other ways, we'd love for you to buy some merch, which is also available on our website, and we have both mugs and t-shirts. As always, thank you so much for listening and being on this journey with us. Until next time, safe travels and see you on the next episode.